There's a photograph that still exists somewhere in the back of a filing cabinet in Hollow Creek, West Virginia. In it, a young boy stands beside his mother on a porch that's seen better days. The boy is maybe 7 years old. His eyes are dark, hollow, not in the way children's eyes get when they're tired, but in the way eyes look when they've been taught that sleep is something to be afraid of. His mother's hand rests on his shoulder, but her fingers are pressed too deep into his collarbone, like she's holding him there, like she's keeping him from floating away or running. The photograph was taken in the summer of 1953. The boy's name was Samuel Pritchard, and by the time autumn arrived that year, Samuel would be dead. But this isn't just Samuel's story. It's the story of every boy born into the Pritchard line for over a century. Because in that family, there was a rule that was never written down, never explained to outsiders, and never questioned by those who lived under its shadow. Every son, every single one, slept beneath his mother's bed. Not beside it, not in the same room. Beneath it, on the floor, in the dark. Every night, from the time they could crawl until the time they turned 13. And if you asked why, no one would tell you. Not the grandmothers, not the uncles, not even the fathers, who had once been boys themselves, curled up on cold wooden floors in the suffocating blackness beneath their own mothers' beds. But Samuel didn't wake up, and when they found him, the town stopped pretending it didn't know. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Hollow Creek wasn't always a town that kept secrets. Or maybe it was, and people just got better at forgetting. By the time Samuel Pritchard was born in 1946, the place had already been hollowed out by coal, by poverty, by men who went into the earth and didn't come back the same. It sat in a valley so deep that the sun only touched the main road for a few hours each day. The rest of the time, the town lived in a kind of perpetual dusk. Gray light, gray houses, gray people. The Pritchards had been there longer than anyone could remember. They owned a small piece of land on the eastern edge of town, where the trees grew too close together and the ground stayed damp even in summer. The family didn't socialize much. They came into town for supplies, for church on Sundays, and then they disappeared back into the woods. The mothers were always thin, pale, with eyes that didn't quite meet yours. The fathers were quiet, bent, like men carrying something heavy they couldn't put down. And the boys were always watchful, always tired. There were 3 Pritchard boys in Samuel's generation. Samuel was the youngest. His older brothers, David and Thomas, had already spent years under their mother's bed before Samuel was born. By the time Samuel was old enough to understand what was happening, David was 12 and Thomas was 10, and every night, without fail, all 3 of them would crawl beneath that iron-framed bed in their mother's room and lie there in the dark until morning. No one outside the family knew. Not really. But people suspected. The way people in small towns always suspect. They saw the way the boys flinched when someone raised their voice. They saw the bruises that didn't quite match the excuses. They saw the way the Pritchard boys never stayed over at a friend's house, never went camping, never slept anywhere but home. And when someone asked, when a teacher or a neighbor or a well-meaning church lady asked why, the answer was always the same. It's just how we do things. And that was enough. Because, in Hollow Creek, you didn't ask about other people's business. You didn't pry. You didn't dig. You just nodded and moved on and pretended you didn't hear the sounds coming from the Pritchard house on certain nights. The sounds of a woman's voice, low and rhythmic, like she was praying, or chanting, or calling something. The rule had a history. It went back further than anyone alive could trace. But the oldest people in Hollow Creek, the ones whose memories stretched back into the dark folds of the 1800s, they remembered hearing about it from their own grandparents. The Pritchard women had always done it, every generation, mother to son. And the sons, when they became fathers, said nothing. They married. They brought their wives into the family, and the wives learned. They learned quickly. There was a story, whispered in the back pews of the Baptist church, that the tradition started with a woman named Iris Pritchard, sometime around 1872. Iris had lost her first son to fever when he was only 3 years old. He died in his sleep, in a small bed by the window, while she slept in the room next door. She didn't hear him cry out, didn't hear him struggle. By the time she found him in the morning, his body was already cold. The grief broke something in her, something fundamental. And when her second son was born 2 years later, she refused to let him out of her sight, refused to let him sleep anywhere she couldn't reach him. So she made him sleep beneath her bed, close enough that she could hear him breathe, close enough that if he stopped, she would know. But Iris didn't stop there. She told her sisters, she told her daughters-in-law, she told anyone in the family who would listen, and the message was always the same. A mother's bed is a place of protection. The space beneath it is sacred. A boy who sleeps there is shielded from the things that come in the night, from the fever, from the shadows, from the hollow men who walk the woods looking for open windows and unguarded children. It sounded like madness, but in a place like Hollow Creek, where children did disappear, where sickness took them without warning, where the woods were deep and the world was cruel, maybe it sounded like something else. Maybe it sounded like survival. By the time Samuel was born, the ritual had been going on for over 70 years. No one questioned it anymore. It was just part of being a Pritchard. The boys slept beneath the bed until they turned 13. Then, and only then, were they allowed to move into their own room. It was a rite of passage, a release, freedom. But Samuel never made it to 13, and when they pulled his small, cold body out from beneath his mother's bed on the morning of October 9th, 1953, there were marks on his wrists, thin, red impressions, like something had been holding him down, like he had tried to crawl out, like he had tried to escape. But the door to his mother's room had been locked from the inside. The official cause of death was suffocation. That's what the county coroner wrote on the death certificate. Accidental suffocation due to restricted airflow in an enclosed sleeping space. It was clean. It was simple. It didn't ask questions that no one in Hollow Creek wanted to answer. But the men who carried Samuel's body out of that house, the volunteer firemen, the deputy sheriff, the neighbor who had been called when the mother started screaming, they didn't talk about it the same way the coroner did. They talked about it in hushed voices at the hardware store, over cigarettes behind the gas station, in the kind of conversations that stopped the moment a woman or a child walked by. They talked about the smell in that room, not the smell of death that came later, but the smell that was already there when they arrived. Damp earth, mildew, something older, something that didn't belong in a house. They talked about the way the air felt thick, like it was pushing against them, like the room didn't want them there. And they talked about the marks, not just on Samuel's wrists, but on the floorboards beneath the bed. Long, deep scratches. The kind of scratches you'd make if you were dragging your fingernails across wood, trying to pull yourself forward, trying to get out. The scratches ran from the center of the space under the bed all the way to the edge, where the bed frame met the wall. Like Samuel had been trying to reach the light, trying to reach the door, but he never made it. His mother, Eleanor Pritchard, was found sitting on the edge of the bed when the men arrived. She wasn't crying, wasn't screaming anymore. She was just sitting there, staring at the wall, her hands folded in her lap. When the deputy asked her what happened, she didn't look at him. She just kept staring. He was supposed to stay, she said quietly. He knew he was supposed to stay. The deputy asked her what she meant, asked her if Samuel had tried to leave the room during the night, asked her if maybe he'd gotten stuck, panicked, hurt himself trying to crawl out. But Eleanor didn't answer. She just repeated the same words, over and over, like a prayer she'd forgotten the ending to. He was supposed to stay. He was supposed to stay. He was supposed to stay. They took her to the hospital in the next county over. Kept her there for 2 weeks under observation. Acute psychological distress, the doctor said. Traumatic shock. Grief. When she came home, she didn't speak about Samuel. Didn't speak much at all. But she also didn't stop the ritual. Her 2 older sons, David and Thomas, still slept beneath her bed every night. Even after what happened. Even after Samuel. Because the rule was the rule. And the Pritchard women didn't break it. Not even when it killed their children. The funeral was small. A handful of people from the church. A few neighbors who felt obligated. The pastor spoke about God's mysterious ways and the comfort of eternal rest, but his voice wavered when he said Samuel's name. He'd seen the boy in Sunday school. seen the dark circles under his eyes, seen the way he never smiled, even when the other children played. David and Thomas stood on either side of their mother at the graveside. David was 13 now, old enough, according to the family tradition, to sleep in his own bed. But when people asked him later, years later, when he was old enough to leave Hollow Creek and never come back, he said he didn't move out from under his mother's bed until he was 15. He said he was too afraid, not of his mother, not exactly, but of what might happen if he left, of what might come for him in the night if he wasn't where he was supposed to be. Thomas was 11 when Samuel died. He had 2 more years to go, 2 more years of sleeping on the cold floor in the suffocating dark, listening to his mother's breathing above him, feeling the weight of the mattress sag just inches from his face. And every night, he thought about Samuel, about the scratches on the floor, about the marks on his little brother's wrists. Thomas never talked about what he heard the night Samuel died, not to the police, not to his father, not to anyone. But decades later, when he was an old man dying in a VA hospital 3 states away, he told a nurse, told her because he needed someone to know, needed someone to carry it after he was gone. He said he heard Samuel trying to get out, heard him gasping, heard the scrape of his fingernails on the wood, and he heard his mother's voice, low and steady, speaking words he didn't understand, words that sounded old, words that sounded like they were meant for something that wasn't Samuel. Thomas said he wanted to crawl out from under his own bed, wanted to run to the door, wanted to scream for help, but he couldn't move. His body wouldn't obey him. It was like something was holding him down, pressing him into the floor, keeping him in place. And then, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, everything went quiet. The scratching stopped, the gasping stopped, and his mother's voice stopped. In the morning, Eleanor unlocked her bedroom door and called for Thomas to come out. She didn't call for Samuel. She already knew. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The town tried to forget, the way towns always do. Samuel's death was filed away as a tragedy, an accident, a terrible mistake born of an old family's strange ways. People stopped talking about it after a few months. The Pritchards faded back into the woods, back into their gray house with its gray secrets, and life in Hollow Creek went on. But the story didn't end with Samuel, because the Pritchard line didn't end. David grew up. Thomas grew up. They had sons of their own, and the question everyone was too afraid to ask was the one that mattered most. Did they make their sons sleep beneath the bed too? David left Hollow Creek in 1968. He was 22 years old, freshly back from Vietnam, and he never set foot in that town again. He moved to Ohio, married a woman who knew nothing about his family, and when their son was born in 1971, David made a promise he kept until the day he died. His son would never sleep beneath a bed. David's wife noticed things about him. The way he couldn't sleep with the bedroom door closed, the way he checked under their son's bed every single night, not looking for monsters the way other fathers did, but looking for something else, something he never explained. She noticed the nightmares, the way he'd wake up gasping, clawing at the sheets like he was trying to pull himself out of something, and she noticed that he never, ever spoke about his mother. When David's mother died in 1983, he didn't go to the funeral, didn't send flowers, didn't call. His wife asked him why, and he just shook his head, said some things were better left buried, said some doors, once you close them, should never be opened again. But Thomas was different. Thomas stayed. He married a local girl in 1962, a quiet woman named Margaret who had grown up 3 houses down from the Pritchards. Margaret knew the stories. Everyone in Hollow Creek knew the stories. But Thomas loved her, and she loved him. And when he told her about the tradition, about what would be expected if they had sons, she didn't run. She didn't argue. She just nodded, because in Hollow Creek, you didn't question the old ways. You didn't fight them. You survived them. Thomas and Margaret had 3 sons, born in 1963, 1965, and 1968, and every single one of them slept beneath their mother's bed from the time they could crawl until the night they turned 13. People in town noticed. Of course they noticed, but no one said anything. Not to Thomas, not to Margaret, not to the authorities. Because what would they say? That a family had an unusual sleeping arrangement? That wasn't illegal, wasn't abuse. Not in any way the law recognized. It was just tradition. Strange, yes. Uncomfortable, yes. But tradition nonetheless. The boys grew up thin and pale and watchful, just like their father had been, just like their grandfather had been. They didn't have friends over, didn't go to sleepovers, didn't talk about what happened at night in their house. And when the oldest son, James, turned 13 in 1976, he was finally allowed to move into his own room. He lasted 3 nights. On the 4th night, Margaret found him curled up on the floor beneath her bed again, shaking, unable to explain why he'd come back. He just kept saying he couldn't sleep anywhere else, that something was wrong when he tried, that the room felt too open, too exposed, too dangerous. James slept beneath his mother's bed until he was 17 years old, until the night he graduated high school, packed a bag, and disappeared. No one in Hollow Creek ever saw him again. The middle son, Michael, made it out at 13, moved into his own room, and stayed there. But he started having seizures a year later. Violent, unexplained seizures that no doctor could diagnose, no medication could control. He died at 16. The death certificate said sudden, unexpected death in epilepsy. But Thomas knew better. Thomas had always known. The youngest son, Christopher, was still sleeping beneath the bed when Thomas died in 1994. Christopher was 26 years old. Christopher Pritchard still lives in Hollow Creek. He's 57 years old now. He never married, never had children. And if you drive past the old Pritchard house on the eastern edge of town, you'll see him sometimes, standing on the porch, staring out into the woods with that same hollow look his great-uncle Samuel had in that photograph from 1953. People don't talk to Christopher much. He keeps to himself, works odd jobs, pays his bills. But everyone in town knows. They know he still lives in that house. They know he never left. And some of them, the ones old enough to remember, the ones whose grandparents whispered the stories, they know something else too. Christopher still sleeps beneath his mother's bed. Margaret died in 2009. She was 71 years old. Cancer. They buried her next to Thomas in the Hollow Creek Cemetery, in a plot not far from where Samuel had been laid to rest 56 years earlier. And after the funeral, after everyone had gone home, Christopher went back to the house, back to his mother's room, back to the space beneath the bed where he'd spent almost every night of his life. The bed frame is still there. The mattress is gone now, rotted through and thrown away years ago. But the frame remains, iron, heavy, bolted to the floor, in a way that seems deliberate, in a way that seems permanent. A reporter tried to interview Christopher once, back in 2012. She was writing a piece about strange Appalachian traditions, and someone had told her about the Pritchards. She drove out to the house, knocked on the door, introduced herself. Christopher listened politely, didn't invite her in, and when she asked him about the sleeping arrangement, about whether the stories were true, he looked at her with those hollow eyes and said something she never forgot. "It's not about tradition," he said quietly. "It's about the deal." She asked him what he meant, asked him what kind of deal. But Christopher just shook his head and closed the door. The reporter left Hollow Creek that afternoon and never came back, but she couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said, about the word he'd used. Deal. Not tradition, not ritual, not family custom. Deal. Like something had been agreed upon, like something had been promised, like the Pritchard women, generation after generation, had been offering their sons to something in exchange for something else. Protection, maybe, or power, or just survival in a world that took everything from people like them. But what were they protecting their sons from? Or what were they protecting by keeping their sons there, trapped in the dark, beneath the weight of their mothers' beds, unable to move, unable to leave, unable to escape? No one knows. The Pritchard women took their secrets to the grave, every single one of them, and the sons who survived, the ones like David who ran, the ones like James who disappeared, they won't talk about it, can't talk about it. Or maybe they're afraid that if they do, something will come for them, something will remember, something will call them back. Christopher Pritchard is the last of the line. He has no children, no siblings left alive, no cousins who carry the name. When he dies, the Pritchard family will die with him. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe some bloodlines are meant to end. Maybe some traditions are meant to be buried and forgotten. But late at night, when the town is dark and quiet, People who live near the old Pritchard house say they can still hear it. A sound like fingernails scraping across wood. A sound like someone trying to crawl out of a space too small, too dark, too suffocating to breathe. And in the morning, when the sun finally reaches that gray house at the edge of the woods, Christopher Pritchard steps out onto the porch. Still alive, still watchful, still keeping whatever deal his family made all those years ago. Some secrets aren't meant to be told. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. And some suns never wake up, but the ones who do, they never really leave.